Nobody knew it would come down to 5 interruptions. Nobody expected silence to be the loudest thing heard that night. Inside the Ohio Civic Convention Hall in Columbus, something was happening. Something electric, unplanned, unscripted. The kind of tension that makes your breath catch without realizing it. It wasn't the lights, though they were blinding. It wasn't the cameras, though they tracked every movement like predators. It was the feeling that tonight was not just another forum. This wasn't Philadelphia or Washington, D.C., or some political stronghold. This was Ohio, the heartland, the swing state, the place where elections teeter and history bends. And tonight, 2 very different visions of leadership were about to collide in front of the nation. On one side, Donald J. Trump, larger than life, unapologetically loud, storming into the hall like he owned it. His arrival brought a wave of sound. Cheers, boos, camera shutters, gasps. He thrived on it, fed by it. His supporters were loud. His critics were louder, and that suited him just fine. On the other, Vice President Kamala Harris, calm, composed, focused. She didn't command the room with volume, but with presence. Her steps were unhurried, her eyes steady. She didn't smile to please. She smiled like someone who already knew how this night would end. From the moment they sat across from each other, the air changed. The moderators, experienced, polished, prepared, tried to keep it structured. "We're here tonight to talk about American leadership," one began. But everyone in the room knew what they were really there for. They came for the clash. They came to see if patience could survive pressure. They came to see if the woman so often labeled too careful could handle the man defined by chaos. And it didn't take long to begin. Trump interrupted Harris once, and the audience flinched. He interrupted her twice, and the moderators exchanged glances. By the 3rd and 4th time, it wasn't a debate anymore. It was a test of endurance, of character, of restraint. And Kamala Harris didn't take the bait. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward. She didn't even roll her eyes. She waited. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't passivity. It was a calculated kind of strength, the kind that doesn't just respond, it waits for the perfect moment to end the conversation altogether. People watching from home could feel it too. In dorm rooms, diners, and living rooms, Americans leaned closer to their screens. Not because of what was being said, but because of what wasn't. And then came the 5th interruption, the one that crossed a line, the one that wasn't just loud. It was personal. It was designed to humiliate her, to strip her patience, and force her to snap. But she didn't snap. She stood up. And what happened next would not only silence Trump, it would ignite the entire room. This is the story of a woman who waited, who absorbed every insult, every interruption, every condescending wave of the hand, until the moment came when she no longer needed to shout back, because the silence around her was already deafening. And when she finally spoke, the crowd didn't just listen. They stood. The Ohio Civic Convention Hall had never held its breath like this before. Tucked in the heart of Columbus, the building was no stranger to political events, town halls, state debates, grassroots rallies. But tonight was different. The line to get in wrapped around the block twice, winding through crowds holding coffee cups, homemade signs, and charged anticipation. People had driven in from as far as Chicago and Pittsburgh. Some had taken overnight buses. Others had waited online for hours to secure a seat. The atmosphere was part civic duty, part sporting event, and all expectation. Inside, the hall was massive, yet strangely intimate. The lights had been dimmed low except for the stage, where 2 wooden podiums faced each other like duelists at dawn. The American flag stood between them, unmoving, as if holding its own breath. On the far end of the stage sat 2 long tables, one for each participant, and a central platform for the moderators. Every camera angle had been tested, every microphone calibrated. Still, the room didn't feel rehearsed. It felt like something was waiting to crack open. Rows of chairs were filled with faces from across America. There were union workers in ironed shirts, college students with earbuds still dangling from their collars, veterans in pressed jackets, mothers with their daughters, and retirees who had seen too many administrations come and go. The diversity in the room wasn't a political statement. It was a reflection of the stakes. Every person here wanted to witness what would happen when 2 ideologies, 2 styles of leadership, collided under one roof. The moderators, both respected journalists known for their steadiness under pressure, had already taken their seats. One was flipping through a stack of note cards, the other was quietly rereading her opening script. They had rehearsed this evening's flow a dozen times, prepared for every topic, from healthcare and economy to climate change and civil discourse. But deep down, they knew. Plans wouldn't matter much once the cameras rolled and the first questions were asked. Backstage, aides moved quietly. Sound engineers gave last-minute instructions. One assistant walked up and down the hallway with a clipboard, whispering stage cues into a mic tucked under his collar. The air smelled faintly of coffee, nerves, and something heavier, tension. This wasn't going to be a normal debate. And then it began. First to enter the hall was Donald Trump. The sound came like a wave. Cheers from the right side of the room, boos from the left, a confused middle ground caught in between. Trump didn't flinch. He walked with the swagger of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. His tie was sharp, his expression sharper. He gave a curt nod to the crowd and took his seat as if it had been waiting for him. Seconds later, Kamala Harris stepped into the light. No music, no drama, just calm. She walked slowly, deliberately, her shoulders squared not in defiance but in steadiness. The crowd's response was more layered. Cheers of support, silence of attention, a few unsure murmurs. She didn't acknowledge them with a wave or smile. She simply took her seat, unfolded a notepad, and clicked her pen once. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Trump filled the room like a fire alarm, Harris like a held breath. The contrast was striking. Even before the first words were exchanged, the audience felt it. This wasn't just a difference in policy, it was a difference in posture. Trump looked like he was ready to fight. Harris looked like she was ready to outlast. The moderators welcomed the audience, thanked the participants, and laid out the rules. But even as they spoke, it was hard to focus on their words. All eyes were bouncing between the two figures seated just feet apart, the air between them charged like an invisible wire stretched taut. When the moderator finally asked the first question, "What does leadership look like in today's America?" you could feel the collective lean forward from every seat in the room. Pens paused. Breaths stopped. Screens lit up as people began recording. And though the night had only just begun, one thing was already clear. This wouldn't be a debate. It would be a reckoning. The first interruption came faster than anyone expected. The moderator had barely finished the opening question. What does leadership look like in today's America? When Kamala Harris leaned slightly forward, pen still in hand, and began to speak in her signature cadence. Slow, measured, deliberate. She had only gotten through her first few sentences. Leadership is not about the loudest voice in the room. It's about clarity, accountability, and the ability to stay grounded when the world isn't. When Trump cut across her. Grounded? He scoffed, loud enough to make the front row twitch. You call what's happening in this country grounded? You've been asleep, Kamala. That's not leadership. That's hiding. The audience gasped softly. Some laughed, others groaned. Harris didn't flinch. She looked at Trump for half a second, blinked once, then returned her eyes to the moderator. "I'd like to finish my answer," she said calmly. No anger, no bite. But the mood in the room had shifted. The tension had taken root. The second interruption was more pointed and more aggressive. Kamala was midway through a response about restoring public trust in democratic institutions. She spoke of transparency, of listening to communities, of working with, not over, local leadership. Trump leaned forward again, waving his hand dismissively. "Oh, please," he said. "Spare us the lecture. Transparency? You couldn't even be honest about your own record." The moderator tried to intervene. "Mr. Trump, please let her—" But Trump didn't stop. "You talk about listening. But where were you when businesses were shutting down and crime was rising? You were tweeting hashtags while cities burned." This time the audience reacted loudly. Louder applause from his base, but noticeable murmurs of disapproval elsewhere. Kamala waited. She didn't jump in. She didn't defend. Instead, she nodded slowly. Not in agreement, but in recognition. She was noting the moment, not validating it. Then, in the same tone as before, "May I continue?" The moderator gestured for her to proceed, and she did. Same voice, same poise, as if nothing had been thrown her way. But the crowd was watching more closely now. The third interruption was sharper, personal. The question had turned to economic policy, and Kamala was speaking about small business support and economic recovery plans. Trump didn't wait long. "You mean the plans that no one reads and no one believes?" he barked. "Your administration has been all talk. You've been in office, and what's changed? Nothing. Prices are up, confidence is down, you're too cautious to make a real decision. He said it like a punchline, and some people laughed like it was one. This time, Kamala's pause was longer. She didn't speak right away. She looked at Trump, not with irritation, but with quiet calculation. Then she turned back to the moderator. There is a difference between being cautious and being careful. The latter keeps people alive. Short, sharp, deadly calm. The audience didn't laugh this time. The fourth interruption felt like a tactic, like a strategy to dominate the room entirely. Kamala had found a rhythm now. She was building a point about restoring civility, not just in politics, but in public life, schools, neighborhoods, discourse. She spoke about rebuilding trust through listening, empathy, and shared values. That was when Trump slammed his hand lightly on the table. Not enough to look aggressive, just enough to get noticed. Empathy, he said, voice rising. Don't preach about empathy. You've divided this country more than anyone. You don't build bridges, you build narratives, and they're all fake. This time, the crowd noise spiked. The moderators tried, again, to restore order. Let's allow the vice president to finish. But Trump waved them off, again. His voice now louder, fingers tapping the table rhythmically, each phrase designed to interrupt Kamala's composure. I've built businesses, you've built speeches, let's be real. At that point, the room was vibrating. Some were clapping, some were shaking their heads. Some were glued to their screens, texting frantically. She's not reacting, she's just sitting there. And she was. Kamala didn't fidget, didn't blink. When she finally responded, she didn't speak to Trump. She looked at the crowd directly and said, "The loudest voice is not always the most right, and patience is not the absence of strength. It is the evidence of it." That line landed like a stone in a still lake. The ripples were visible on faces, in body language, in the sudden stillness of the crowd. 4 interruptions, 4 tests. And Kamala Harris had passed everyone without raising her voice. The room didn't know it yet, but the 5th interruption was coming. And this time, the silence would break. It began with a silence. Not the silence of hesitation, but the silence of something winding up. The moderator had just posed a question about character in leadership. Kamala Harris leaned slightly forward, her tone level, her voice steady. Character, she said, isn't something you announce. It's something you reveal when no one is watching. She continued, I believe in a kind of leadership that's quiet in the noise. Leadership that doesn't panic, that doesn't shout over fear, but listens through it. And that was when it happened. The 5th interruption. Trump didn't just speak. He lunged forward, voice rising not with volume, but with something sharper, contempt. Oh, please, he said, loud enough to make the microphones crackle. You keep talking about listening. You keep talking about silence. You know what I hear when you're silent? Nothing. Nothing that helps this country. You're not calm, Kamala. You're just weak. There was a beat, just a fraction of a second, but it echoed like a drumbeat. Then he leaned in further, voice colder now. You've been vice president for years. What exactly have you done? What exactly do you lead? I'll tell you what. People don't trust you because you wait too long to speak, and you wait because you have nothing to say. Gasps shot through the hall, audible, unfiltered. The moderator raised a hand. Mr. Trump, please let the vice president respond, but he wasn't finished. He raised his voice over the moderator, his hand gesturing at the crowd. People don't want someone who sits still while the country burns. They don't want patience. They want power, and they know the difference. A pause. The room shifted. The crowd bristled. Some clapped, some booed. And then Kamala Harris stood up. Slowly, not abruptly, not defensively. Deliberately. She didn't look at Trump. She didn't look at the moderator. She stepped out from behind her table and walked to the center of the stage. Trump froze. The audience didn't make a sound. The moderators leaned forward, unsure if they should intervene. And Kamala, now standing directly under the lights, turned not to Trump, but to the audience. The cameras zoomed in, and for a moment, the only sound in the hall was her breath. Then she spoke. When I was a young girl, she began, I watched my mother get talked over in rooms just like this one. Rooms where men raised their voices and called it strength, where silence was treated like surrender. She turned slightly, now facing the camera. But what they never understood is that silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's preparation. She turned fully to Trump. And sometimes, Mr. Trump, the reason I don't interrupt you is because you do a perfectly good job showing the country exactly who you are all on your own. The crowd erupted, not in a wave, in a thunderclap. People stood. Applause shook the rafters. Some whistled. Others simply clapped with slow, deliberate rhythm. The kind that doesn't celebrate a comeback, but a reckoning. Trump tried to speak, but the microphones didn't catch it. His mouth moved. His hand waved. But the noise in the hall swallowed every word. He raised his voice. "That's not—" he began. But Kamala turned back to the crowd. "They say I'm too quiet, too slow to respond, that I wait too long to speak." She paused. "You're right, I wait, because when I speak—" She pointed to the crowd. "I want it to matter." The applause doubled. A group of students in the back row began chanting her name. A woman near the front wiped a tear from her cheek. A retired veteran rose to his feet and saluted. Trump, still standing, shifted his weight. His jaw clenched. He looked at the moderators, at the crowd, then back at Kamala. For the first time that evening, he said nothing. "And Kamala?" She looked back at the moderator, nodded, and said, "I'm ready for your next question." And just like that, the room belonged to her. The moment Kamala Harris sat back down, the oxygen in the room changed. It wasn't just that she had silenced Donald Trump. It wasn't just that she had flipped the dynamic of the night. It was something deeper, a collective realization, both in the hall and across the country, that they had just witnessed a shift. The moderators, visibly shaken but regaining composure, thanked both participants and attempted to move the forum forward. Their voices were slightly louder now, trying to reclaim control over a room that had become something more than a stage. It was now a space of reckoning, a theater of transformation. Trump didn't speak again for nearly 2 full minutes. For him, 2 minutes of silence was an eternity. And the cameras knew it. They lingered on his tightened jaw, the way his fingers fidgeted against the side of his chair, how his eyes darted to the side as the crowd continued to steal glances toward Kamala. She, on the other hand, was unmoved. Her pen was back in her hand, her notes still neatly organized. She didn't lean in. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply waited. The same patience that had once been questioned now felt like dominance. In the audience, the reaction was tangible. People who had come skeptical now leaned forward, nodding. Supporters who had remained quiet until that moment erupted in approval. Even some undecided attendees, the ones who had been unsure if calmness could compete with charisma, found themselves clapping. In the back rows, a college debate coach texted her team, "You're watching a masterclass." In the balcony, a man in a red hat who had clapped for Trump earlier folded his arms and stared silently at the stage. Moderators tried to resume the flow. "Let's move to domestic policy," but the room wasn't ready to move on. Not yet. Because that moment, the 5th interruption, the walk to center stage, the speech without shouting, had struck a nerve. Across social media, the moment was already going viral. Clips were cut and shared in real time. The hashtags "Charges Kamala waited" and "Next year's silence wins" began trending within 30 minutes. Even political opponents began acknowledging the power of the moment. CNN replayed the scene with analysis. Fox News tried to downplay it, but still aired the entire clip. MSNBC labeled it "The night calm took control." But more powerful than pundits were the people. In homes across Ohio, and far beyond, families were talking about it. At kitchen tables and text messages, in group chats and Slack threads, people repeated her words. "Sometimes the reason I don't interrupt you is because you do a perfectly good job showing the country exactly who you are." It wasn't just a comeback line, it was a philosophy. Back in the hall, Trump finally spoke again, but the tone had changed. His voice was slightly quieter, his cadence more measured. But the damage had been done. He tried to pivot back to substance, attacking Harris's policies, questioning numbers, repeating slogans. But the crowd didn't react the same way. Where earlier his interruptions had been met with applause, now there were mixed responses. Some clapped, but fewer. Some booed, but softer. Most simply listened. Kamala didn't react to him anymore. She spoke directly to the moderators, to the audience, to the camera, and that made all the difference. The moderator asked about healthcare. Kamala answered clearly, listing programs, referencing impact. Trump interrupted again, but this time the moderator cut him off. "Mr. Trump," she said firmly, "we'll give you your time. Please allow her to finish." The crowd applauded the moderator. It was subtle, but it confirmed the shift. The room had recalibrated. It no longer rewarded volume. It respected control. And control belonged to Kamala Harris now. She didn't have to dominate the space. She already owned it. She didn't have to clap back. She had already defined the rhythm of the night, and while Trump kept trying to recapture the spotlight, he couldn't escape what had just happened. For the rest of the forum, Kamala's presence loomed large, not because she was louder, but because every time she spoke, the room settled. She had reset the terms of the night, and the country was watching. By the time the forum ended, no one remembered the final question. It didn't matter. The moderators gave their closing remarks. The applause was polite, but the tension was still lingering, heavy in the air. Not because people were angry, but because they were still processing what they had just seen. Kamala Harris stood, thanked the moderators, nodded once toward Trump, and exited the stage the same way she entered, calm, composed, not looking back. Trump left seconds later, but the room had already moved on. Cameras turned, conversations erupted, phones lit up with messages. Did you see that part? She didn't even raise her voice. He couldn't even respond. It was the kind of moment that transcended politics. By midnight, the internet was ablaze. On TikTok, creators stitched clips of the fifth interruption with Harris's walk to the center of the stage. On Twitter, political figures, athletes, and artists were quoting her line. "Sometimes I don't interrupt you because you do a perfectly good job showing the country exactly who you are." It hit different. It wasn't just a burn, it was clarity. Late-night hosts opened their monologues with it. Debate coaches rewrote lessons around it. Civil rights groups used it to highlight how patience has always been misread as weakness, especially for women of color. In classrooms the next morning, students discussed it with teachers. In offices, employees passed clips around as examples of real leadership. In churches, some pastors used it to speak about grace under pressure. And in homes, thousands of homes, parents showed their kids what had happened. Not because it was political, but because it was powerful. One mother in Dayton told her teenage daughter, "You don't always have to shout to win an argument. You just have to wait for the moment they show themselves. And then, when you speak, speak like you mean it." The power of the moment wasn't in its volume, it was in its timing. Kamala Harris didn't plan to be interrupted 5 times, but she came prepared to wait, to hold, to absorb. And when she finally stood up, she didn't just respond. She reset the rules. In an age of constant noise, she reminded everyone that composure isn't silence, it's control. Personal perspective, as requested. To me, this wasn't just a political win. It was a cultural pivot. For too long, we've associated power with who can yell the loudest, who dominates the mic, who interrupts the most. But Kamala Harris showed something different. That where true strength isn't measured in decibels, it's measured in discipline. That the ability to wait, to withstand, and then strike with precision is leadership in its purest form. She didn't just win the moment. She made it matter. Call to action. So, if you believe patience is power, if you believe presence speaks louder than volume, if you believe leadership is about clarity, not chaos, share this story. Leave a comment about what the moment meant to you, and subscribe, because we're not done telling stories that remind us that, in the middle of the storm, you don't need to outshout the thunder. You just need to speak when the world finally stops to listen.